April 15th, 1945. Bergen-Belsen, Germany. The silence was the first thing they noticed. Not the bodies stacked like cordwood along the perimeter fence. Not the skeletal figures who moved like shadows between the barracks. Not the smell. Though God, the smell was everywhere, thick and sweet and rotten, the smell of death that had stopped being exceptional and become ordinary. It was the silence. 50,000 human beings crammed into a space designed for 10,000, and there was almost no sound. No crying, no screaming, no praying. The dying do not make noise. They simply stop. Lieutenant Colonel James Johnston of the 113th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, British Second Army, stood at the camp gates and felt something inside him break. He had fought across North Africa. He had landed at Normandy. He had seen men torn apart by artillery and burned alive in tanks, frozen to death in winter foxholes. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the methodical erasure of humanity, for the bureaucratic efficiency of mass death, for the sight of women whose bodies had consumed themselves, whose arms were thin as kindling, whose eyes were too large for their faces, staring at him with neither hope nor fear. Just exhaustion. Among those women was a girl. She was 22 years old, though she looked 60. Her name was Gisella Perl, though the SS had reduced her to a number, a -7329. She weighed 63 pounds. Her hair had fallen out in clumps. Her teeth were loose in her gums. Her abdomen was distended with fluid, her legs swollen with edema, her skin covered in sores that wept pus and blood. She had typhus. She had dysentery. She had tuberculosis. And according to the British Army doctor who examined her on the afternoon of April 16th, she had 3 days to live. By dawn on April 17th, she was walking, not easily, not without pain, but walking, breathing, alive, saved by a man she would never forget, using medicine she could not comprehend, embodying a principle that seemed impossible after everything she had endured, that her life was worth saving. This is the story of what happened in those 11 hours. But more than that, it is the story of what it meant. Gisella Perl was born in Romania in 1923, the daughter of a Jewish tailor. She was bright, ambitious, determined. She wanted to be a doctor. In 1942, she was accepted to medical school in Budapest. She completed 1 year, then the Germans came. In May 1944, she was deported to Auschwitz. Her parents were gassed within hours of arrival. Her younger brother was sent to a labor camp and died of pneumonia 3 months later. Gisella survived the initial selection because she lied. She told Dr. Joseph Mengele, the camp physician who decided who lived and who died with a flick of his thumb, that she was a trained gynecologist. She was not. She had completed 1 year of medical school, but Mengele needed someone to assist in the camp infirmary, and so she was spared. For the next 10 months, she worked in Block 10, the medical experimentation barracks. She held women down while Mengele injected chemicals into their uteruses. She assisted in surgeries performed without anesthesia. She watched pregnant women dragged to the gas chambers because pregnancy was an automatic death sentence in Auschwitz. But when she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, she began performing abortions. In secret, using her bare hands, with no instruments, no anesthesia, no antiseptic, she terminated pregnancies in the filthy bunks of the barracks. She did it because it was the only way to save the mothers, and she did it knowing that every life she saved came at the cost of a life she took. By January 1945, the Red Army was closing in. The SS evacuated Auschwitz, forcing the prisoners on death marches westward. Gisella survived the march to Ravensbrück, then to Bergen-Belsen, where she arrived in March 1945. By then, she was already dying. The typhus had taken root. The dysentery had hollowed her out. She weighed less than 70 pounds. She had stopped menstruating a year earlier. Her body was cannibalizing itself, in burning muscle for fuel, shutting down non-essential systems to preserve the brain and heart. When the British arrived on April 15th, she was lying on a wooden bunk, too weak to move, drifting in and out of consciousness. She did not know who the British were. She did not know the war was ending. She knew only that she was dying, and that dying no longer frightened her. It was simply the next thing. And then a man knelt beside her bunk. An American. Captain Michael Halberstam was not supposed to be at Bergen-Belsen. He was a U.S. Army physician attached to the 84th Infantry Division, which was advancing toward the Elbe River. But on April 14th, the British Second Army had liberated Bergen-Belsen and immediately sent out distress calls. The camp was a biological catastrophe. Typhus was rampant. Dysentery, tuberculosis, typhoid, gangrene, every disease of filth and starvation was spreading unchecked. The British Medical Corps was overwhelmed. They needed help. Any help. Halberstam volunteered. He arrived on the morning of April the 16th, and within an hour, he understood that this was not a medical crisis. It was a triage of the damned. There were more than 10,000 corpses in the camp, unburied. Another 13,000 prisoners were so far gone that nothing could save them. They were the walking dead, their organs failing, their immune systems collapsed, their bodies days or hours away from complete shutdown. The British doctors were making brutal calculations. They had limited supplies, limited penicillin, limited sulfur drugs, limited intravenous fluids, limited blood plasma. They could not save everyone, so they made a decision. Prioritize the salvageable, or the ones who could be brought back with aggressive intervention, the ones who still had fight left. Gisella Perl was not on that list. When Halberstam examined her, running his hands over her distended abdomen, checking her pulse, listening to her labored breathing, he recorded in his field notes, female, early 20s, severe malnutrition, advanced typhus, multi-organ failure likely. Prognosis, terminal, 48 to 72 hours. But then he did something that defied the calculus of triage. He decided to try anyway. He did not explain why in his notes. Perhaps it was because she was young. Perhaps it was because she opened her eyes and looked at him, and in that look, he saw something, not hope, but recognition. The recognition of one human being seeing another. Or perhaps it was simply because he could not accept the idea that this girl, who had survived so much, who had endured so much, should die now, 3 days after liberation, because the mathematics of medicine said she was not worth the resources. He gave the order. Start an IV, administer fluids. Penicillin, streptomycin, plasma. Monitor vitals every 30 minutes. The British nurses thought he was wasting medicine. One of them said in her diary, "The American doctor insisted on treating one of the terminal cases. We thought him mad. We had so little and so many who needed it more." But Halberstam did not stop. What happened in those 11 hours was not a miracle. It was medicine, brutal, aggressive, cutting-edge medicine, applied with a desperation born from the knowledge that every minute mattered. Gisella's body was in a state of shock. She had lost so much fluid through dysentery that her blood pressure was barely detectable. Her veins had collapsed, making it almost impossible to start an IV. Halberstam tried 3 times, missing the vein, before finally threading the needle into a vein in her ankle. He hung 2 bags of saline and 1 of plasma, desperately scarce, reserved for battlefield trauma cases, and watched as the fluids dripped into her body. Her fever was 104 degrees. Typhus. The bacteria spread by body lice, which were everywhere in the camp. Typhus causes vascular inflammation, leading to organ failure, delirium, coma, and death. The only treatment in 1945 was supportive care and antibiotics, if you had antibiotics. Halberstam injected her with penicillin, a drug so new that it had only been in mass production for 2 years. Mummy followed it with a dose of streptomycin, another experimental antibiotic, and prayed that her immune system had enough strength left to fight. Her lungs were full of fluid. Pulmonary edema, a complication of both starvation and typhus. She was drowning from the inside. Halberstam elevated her head, administered oxygen from a portable tank, and manually cleared her airway when she began to choke. For 6 hours, she did not respond. Her pulse remained thready, her breathing shallow. Her temperature climbed to 105. Halberstam began to think the nurses were right, that he was wasting medicine, that she was too far gone. And then, at 2 a.m. on April the 17th, her fever broke. It did not drop slowly. It crashed. Within an hour, her temperature fell to 101. Her pulse strengthened. Her breathing steadied. At 4 a.m., she opened her eyes. At 6 a.m., she spoke. Her first words were in Yiddish. Bin ich toyt? Am I dead? Halberstam, who spoke passable Yiddish from his childhood in Brooklyn, answered, Nein, ihr seid leben. No, you are alive. By 8 a.m., she was sitting up. By noon, with assistance, she was standing. By evening, she took her first steps. The British nurses who had doubted Halberstam were stunned. Lieutenant Morrison wrote, I do not know what that man did, but he pulled her back from the grave. I have never seen anything like it. But Gisella knew what he had done. He had decided she was worth saving. There is an object that appears again and again in the testimonies of Bergen-Belsen survivors. Not bread, though bread was sacred. Not water, though water was life. The object is the IV bag, the clear plastic pouch suspended from a makeshift stand, dripping saline or plasma or glucose into the body of a dying prisoner. It became, for many survivors, a symbol of something they had been taught to believe no longer existed, the idea that they were human beings, worthy of care. The Nazis had spent years stripping them of that belief. They had been tattooed with numbers, starved, beaten, and worked to death. The camps were designed to erase identity, to reduce human beings to biological machines that consumed calories and produced work until they broke down and were discarded. And then the Americans and British arrived, and they brought IV bags. The IV bag was not just medicine, it was a statement. It said, your life has value, your suffering matters, you are worth the effort, the expense, and the time it takes to save you. For Gisella Perl, and the IV bag hanging beside her bunk was the first evidence she had seen in nearly a year that the world she remembered, the world where doctors healed, where human life was sacred, where mercy was not a weakness, still existed. She stared at it for hours, watching the fluid drip, feeling it enter her body, cold at first, then warming as it spread through her veins, and she began to cry. Not from pain, from disbelief. In the weeks that followed, Gisella recovered. Slowly, painfully, but she recovered. The typhus receded, the dysentery subsided. Her body, given food and water and medicine, began to rebuild itself. By May, she weighed 80 pounds. By June, 95. By July, she was well enough to leave the recovery hospital and begin the long, impossible process of rebuilding a life. She emigrated to the United States in 1947, so she completed her medical education at Columbia University. She became an obstetrician and gynecologist, specializing in high-risk pregnancies. She spent the rest of her career saving lives, delivering babies, treating complications, and doing everything in her power to ensure that the women under her care survived childbirth. She worked until she was 78 years old. She delivered more than 3,000 babies, and she never forgot the American doctor who saved her life. In 1982, she testified at a trial. She was asked why she had chosen to become a doctor after everything she had endured. She said, "Because I was shown that life is worth saving, that even when everything is taken from you, even when you are reduced to a number and left to die, there are people who will fight to bring you back. And I wanted to be one of those people." She was asked what she remembered most about the day she was saved. She did not mention the medicine. She did not mention the IV, though it had become a symbol in her memory. She mentioned the doctor's hands. "They were gentle," she said. "After so much cruelty, after so many hands that hurt me, his hands were gentle, and I thought, if there is still gentleness in the world, then maybe there is still hope." The story of Gisella Perl is not unique. Across Bergen-Belsen, across Dachau, across Buchenwald and Mauthausen and every other camp the Allies liberated, American and British doctors performed the same desperate calculus. They took prisoners who had been abandoned to die and decided they were worth saving. They used scarce resources, penicillin that could have gone to wounded soldiers, plasma that was needed on the front lines, calories that could have fed their own men, and gave them to people the Nazis had declared worthless. Why? Not because it was strategically necessary, not because it advanced the war effort, but because it was the right thing to do. Because the ideology they were fighting for held that human life had intrinsic value, that every person, regardless of race or religion or nationality, deserved dignity. That mercy was not a luxury to be afforded only in times of peace, but a duty to be upheld even in the midst of war. This was the difference between the two sides. The Nazis measured human worth by utility, by strength, by racial purity, by productivity. When a person ceased to be useful, they were discarded. And the camps were the logical endpoint of that philosophy. Industrial-scale disposal of human beings deemed unworthy of life. The Americans and British measured human worth by existence, by the simple fact of being alive. And so when they found the camps, they did not turn away. They did not calculate the cost-benefit of saving the survivors. They simply saved them, because that is what their ideology demanded. The IV bag became the symbol of that ideology. The saline dripping into the veins of a dying girl was not just medicine. It was a refutation of everything the Nazis had built, a refutation of the idea that some lives matter more than others, a refutation of the belief that mercy is weakness. It was proof that even in the darkest moment of the 20th century, there were still people who believed that life was sacred. The April 15th, 1945 was not the end of the horror. 13,000 prisoners died at Bergen-Belsen after liberation, their bodies too broken, their diseases too advanced, their spirits too shattered to survive even with care. The British buried them in mass graves, bulldozing the bodies because there was no other way. The living walked among the dead for weeks. The smell lingered for months. But for Gisella Perl, April 15th was the beginning of recovery, the beginning of a new life, the beginning of a future she had not believed she would have. She lived until 1988. She died in her sleep, surrounded by her children and grandchildren in New York, in a country that had given her refuge when her own had tried to erase her. She was 65 years old, saying she had lived 43 years longer than the British doctor said she would. And in those 43 years, she saved lives. She brought life into the world. She became the thing that had saved her, a person who fought for the living, even when the odds were impossible. Because that is what the IV bag taught her. That is what Captain Michael Halberstam taught her. That is what America, at its best, represented. The belief that no life is beyond saving. That mercy is not a calculation, but a commitment. That even when the world descends into madness, there are still people who will kneel beside the dying and say, "You are worth this. You are worth everything." The IV bag is long gone. The camp is a memorial now. The barracks have been torn down. The bodies have been buried. The survivors have died one by one, taking their memories with them. But the principle remains. The principle that saved Gisella Perl on April 17, 1945. The principle that drove an American doctor to waste scarce medicine on a girl the world had decided was already dead. The principle that said, life is sacred, mercy is strength, and humanity, no matter how broken, is always worth rebuilding. That principle is fragile. It requires effort. It requires sacrifice. It requires people who are willing to fight for it, even when the cost is high, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the world says it is not worth the trouble. But it is the only principle worth having. And on that day, in that camp, in those 11 hours, it won. Gisella Perl lived, and the world was better for it.